video, I'm going to go over the second set of notes for political geography, and the title that you should add to your notes is Territorial Disputes and Colonialism. So you can pause the video at any time if you need to take some more time to write, but I'm going to kind of go through each of these slides. So earlier this week, we talked about nations, states, and borders. And we said nations were groups of people who have similar identity and who have similar history. States are countries, so states have clear boundaries. And then borders are those borders, right? Those internationally recognized borders. But the distinctions between these terms are important because the world is divided by borders. And borders impact the people that live or don't live there. So although we like to think of states and countries as being pretty clear, like in terms of pretty clear boundaries, oftentimes there is division and conflict that's caused by those boundaries. And oftentimes it's because the people who live in particular areas are not quite as neat, right? The boundaries between people are not quite as neat as those boundaries on the map would like us to believe. So who cares about any of these? One of you wrote an introductory assignment, and this is for my other class, but we had this introductory assignment, and someone defined a border as a fake line that you can't see that separates different states, countries, and continents on our planet. So in many places, you can't see that line, right? And it is fake. It is human created. It is something that was created by human beings. And as we'll see, though, these fake lines have consequences in the real world. And here's a couple of examples. On the left-hand side, you're going to see the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, where groups of ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, were pitted against each other by colonial powers and caused lasting conflict in Rwanda and lasting effects in this horrific genocide. On the right-hand side, you're going to see migration patterns of Indians from India after 1947, after the partition, and you'll see this on a further slide as well. But these boundaries that are created have real-world consequences for people. So why do territorial disputes occur? Once again, please write down anything that you see in yellow here. But there's lots of reasons why territorial disputes or border disputes occur. And the first one is conflict over control over natural resources. So countries, if you have control over a country, you have sovereignty over a country, you have control over its natural resources. So there's fight for that control. Countries want to gain more control over natural resources, such as rivers, fertile farmland, mineral or petroleum resources, oil. Territorial disputes can also be caused over culture, religion, and ethnic conflict. So when multiple groups claim a similar territory, or one group of people kind of end up on the wrong side of the boundary, that can create some conflict. Also, they're created by unclear language. So sometimes treaties that set up the original boundary aren't clear, or there's disputes over that language. And that can cause territorial disputes as well. And then when boundaries are created by outside powers, we're going to talk specifically about colonialism in this video, but when boundaries are created by outside powers that did not, that don't live there, don't know the people, don't ask the people what they want, that can create some problems, can create territorial disputes in the future. So many of today's disputes can trace their origins back to the colonial period, and so that's that last point there. So I'll give it a quick example. So this is India. India, up until 1947-ish, 748, was controlled by the British, or it had been controlled by the British for a good amount of time. So it was a colony of Great Britain. And so this is a map of India during that colonial rule. It is larger than India is today, so it included India. It also included the country of what we now know as Pakistan and Bangladesh as well over here, and some other regions as well. So in 1947, British rule was ending in India, and the British government decided that they were going to partition or basically divide India into multiple independent countries. And so at the time, they divided India into India and Pakistan. And the green areas, the India area, was supposed to be majority Hindu. So they tried to divide it among religious lines. But it was still this boundary created by the outside power. The people weren't didn't have a voice in where that partition line was going to go. And Pakistan, on the other hand, was majority Muslim. But once again, people don't live in clear boxes, right? It's not that all Pakistani Muslims lived on this side of the line and all Hindus lived on this side of the line. So when the line was drawn, that line created consequences. If you were Muslim living in India, there was violence against you. If you were Hindu living in Pakistan, neighbors started turning on neighbors and seeking out their Hindu neighbors or their Muslim neighbors, depending on if they ended up on the wrong side of the line. So there's these mass migrations of people who ended up on the quote unquote wrong side of the line amongst those other countries, and so that created this massive migration, but also this massive human rights violations from both sides. And there's also this region up here, this region of Kashmir, and it was really unclear. Kashmir was a disputed territory between India and Pakistan, and today we still see conflict in the region of Kashmir due to those boundaries that were created, due to that dispute over that boundary. So when we talk about a colony, we're going to define a couple words. So a colony is a territory that's controlled or occupied by another country. And so when we use the term colonialism, we're talking about an effort by one country to establish settlements in another territory and to impose its political, economic, and cultural control. So we'll go into a little bit of history, but really from about the 1500s to the middle part of the 1900s, many portions of the world were colonies of other countries. And the goal of colonialism was multiple reasons. So now we're going to get into the question, where and when did colonialism occur? So the first question is why? So why would countries want to control another colony? Why would they want to control another region? And so the majority of colonialism was European states that colonized other parts of the world. So the European countries were those colonizing powers, came to control large portions of the world through colonialism. And there were multiple reasons. There were kind of three major reasons why, motivations, right, in order for this to happen. And we can summarize those three motivations in 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. So first one is God, right? So to promote religion. At the time, most European countries were Christian, and one of the tenets of Christianity is to go out and to spread the word, to convert people to your religion. And so by controlling territories outside of your own country, you're going to be able to bring more people into your religion. You're going to be able to convert people in those new lands. The second one is gold. So gold is not necessarily just gold, but wealth. And this was the wealth of natural resources. So a country like Great Britain, small island country, doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the raw materials they're going to need to fund and to fuel their industrialization. What do they, they have these factories, but they need the resources to manufacture into other things, whether it's textiles or automobiles or whatever it is. And so colonies provided those natural resources to get those natural resources to find new markets for their products. And then the last one was glory. So glory is really just about competition, to make themselves more powerful relative to their neighbors through the number of colonies that they had. So in the first wave of colonization, we really starts about the 1500s and continues to about the late 1700s, early 1800s. And the first wave of colonization was focused on the Americas. We know this today as when we think about the original 13 colonies, we were a British colony. But the French controlled large swaths of land in North America. The Spanish controlled large swaths of land. If you think about where our Spanish-speaking countries are today, our Portuguese-speaking countries of the world, that all relates back to colonialism. So over here we have our Portuguese territory. Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country today. We are an English-speaking country because we're British territory. The second wave of colonization was between the late 1800s and all the way to the middle part of the 20th century, or the middle part of the 1900s. And that was really focused on Africa as well as South and Southeast Asia. And so in 1800, we have a map of Africa that looks like this. A lot of regions within Africa were independent. They were the kingdoms. They were controlled by themselves. Some regions were controlled by other lands. So, for example, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire. But many of those regions were all their own kingdoms, all their own governing bodies. By 1913, Africa had been divided by the majority, had been divided up by colonial powers due to the abundance of natural resources that Africa had to offer, and at the time, some of the advanced weaponry that Europeans had. And that wasn't always the case, but at that time, that was the case. So what was created here were these new boundaries. So going back to our concept of boundaries, the European countries created what we know as superimposed boundaries. So a superimposed boundary is a term that's used for a type of boundary that's forced upon people. It's forced upon its inhabitants without asking the people who live there, and it's often the result of colonialism. Here's another example of superimposed boundaries. So the second wave of colonialism also focused on Asia. So we have examples here. So India was a British colony. The Dutch controlled what we know as Indonesia. Japan was actually in and of itself its own colonizing power. So Japan took control of Korea and Taiwan. And then there was some influence by the British, the Americans, and the French in China. The British controlled Hong Kong, and then we have French Indochina, which was Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So most countries eventually get their independence. So you're going to learn a lot more about colonialism, the history of colonialism, those independence movements in world history next year, which will be a full year course. So we're just kind of touching on colonialism as it relates to our current boundaries. But most countries eventually got their independence. They struggle, they fight for independence. It's going to vary by region. But after independence, many former colonies were still stuck with those boundaries that were drawn by outsiders. So they're still stuck with those superimposed boundaries. So when we look at conflict today, a lot of conflict that comes from boundary disputes can be traced back to this colonial period, to those boundaries that were created by, those superimposed boundaries were created by colonies. So an example here is conflicts in Africa today. Many ethnic conflicts, this is conflicts in Africa over time, but there's still over 15 major conflicts still active today in Africa, including currently in the state of Sudan. And many of them can be traced back to ethnic differences or ethnic conflicts that were created by those boundaries. So territorial disputes are major causes of war and terrorism. Territorial disputes is disputes over territory, conflict over territory. And so here are some examples of how those cause war and terrorism. So groups still fighting today due to problems caused by colonial boundaries. States often try to assert their sovereignty over a territory through invasion. Or non-state governments use terrorist tactics to get their demands met. So international law does not support any use of force by one state over another. But as we know, in early 2022, Russia did invade Ukraine. So this is an example of a territorial dispute. So this is an invasion map of Ukraine. But you can see that that was reprimanded, or there's a big outcry because Russia basically invaded an independent country. But part of that was due to the fact that Russia did see some of the regions on the outskirts of Ukraine as Russian-speaking people, as Russian territory. And they believed that that was theirs to take. And so a lot of history goes into these conflicts and, even within countries, non-state groups. So this is an example of the Irish Republican Army. The Irish Republican Army is basically a terrorist organization within Ireland that seeks, within Northern Ireland, that seeks to kind of regain control for the Irish people. And oftentimes conflicts occur because people don't feel like their voices are heard, or they have no outlet for their voices to be heard. So that's kind of internal. This is more external with that group invading. So territorial disputes raise a lot of questions. And you're next week going to be taking a look at your own territorial dispute, your own border conflict. And some of the questions that you want to think about in this is these. So what if one country invades another to take land that they think is theirs? Does it matter if there's a large ethnic group in that invaded country that agrees with the invasion. So let's say Russia invades Ukraine, but you have these Russia, or not let's say that did happen, but you have these Russian speaking people and they see themselves as Russian. They live in Ukraine. What if they're welcoming of that Russian invasion? What if they believe that that should happen? Now, I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to justify the war in Ukraine or the invasion of Ukraine, but this happens all the time. What if they try to annex, they try to take over that portion that has those people in it, and they agree with that invasion? What happens then? What if an ethnic group no longer wants to be part of a country that they're currently part of? Do they have the right to fight to leave? So we call this secession. So, for example, South Sudan, the newest country as of 2011, they seceded from the state of Sudan. And part of it was that the southern portion of Sudan saw themselves as ethnically, economically very different from the rest of Sudan. Do they have the right to leave? In this case, they won their independence. But we also know that in this country, the South seceded at one point. We fought a war over that. We fought a war to keep them with us. Does the country that they're in get a chance to say, no, you can't leave? So how do these issues get resolved and by whom? Do only the countries and people involved have a say, or does the rest of the world have a responsibility to help solve the problem? And that is part of what we're still, considering with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're going to do a case study. There will be a couple questions on this case study on your test eventually. So I do want you to watch the video. So one example of a border dispute is in the northwest region of China. So this is China here, and there's a region of northwestern China known as Xinjiang. This is an area that's been disputed regularly throughout history, and currently it's occupied by two major ethnic groups, the Han Chinese, which is the largest ethnic group in all of China, and another population called the Uyghurs. So Uyghurs are an ethnic group that outnumber Chinese people in this region, and they are non-Chinese. They live in China, but they are an ethnic group that is majority Muslim. They see themselves as more Central Asian than Chinese, and they want their own country. They want an autonomous state. Right now, they have a lot of autonomy, but China also wants Xinjiang to remain under Chinese control. So the question is, who controls this region? Are they part of China? Are they not part of China? Are they under their own control? Now, the problem is that the Chinese are doing everything they can to control this region. And in effect, they have persecuted, which means treating poorly the people who live there. So they have encouraged migration of more Chinese people, Han Chinese people, into this region in order to try to outnumber the Uyghur population. There have been terrorist attacks by the Uyghur population against Chinese people due to the fact that, once again, not feeling like they have a voice. And then also the biggest human rights violation that is a concern right now is that the Chinese people have started setting up what we call these re-education camps. And these re-education camps are many Uyghur people are being forced into them, put into them. Some people see them as essentially concentration camps. And if you speak out against the Chinese government, you're put in these re-education camps. People have had family members that have been in these camps, and they don't know where these family members are, and they're reporting that they have been placed in these camps. So you're gonna watch the video here. So you're gonna watch the video here, and then the word you need to write down is genocide. So some people have accused the Chinese of genocide against the Uyghur people, and genocide is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. All right, so I'm going to leave it here. You're going to watch the video and take a few notes on China and the Uyghur population, and you're going to, that's our notes for today. All right, have a good weekend.